Section 1 of Early Kings of Norway. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Early Kings of Norway by Thomas Carlyle. Section 1, Preface, Chapters 1 and 2. Preface. The Icelanders, in their long winter, had a great habit of writing, and were, and still are, excellent in penmanship, says Dahlmann. It is to this fact that any little history there is of the Norse Kings and their old tragedies, crimes, and heroisms is almost all due. The Icelanders, it seems, not only made beautiful letters on their paper or parchment, but were laudably observant and desirous of accuracy, and have left us such a collection of narratives, Sagas, literally, says, as for quantity and quality, is unexampled among rude nations. Snorro Sturleson's history of the Norse Kings is built out of these old sagas, and has in it a great deal of poetic fire, not a little faithful sagacity applied in sifting and adjusting these old sagas, and, in a word, deserves, were it once well edited, furnished with accurate maps, chronological summaries, etc., to be reckoned among the great history books of the world. It is from these sources, greatly aided by accurate, learned, and unwearied Dahlmann, the German professor, that the following rough notes of the early Norway Kings are hastily thrown together. In histories of England, Rapin's excepted, next to nothing has been shown of the many and strong threads of connection between English affairs and Norse. Chapter 1. Harald Fairhair. Till about the year of grace 860 there were no kings in Norway, nothing but numerous jarls, essentially kinglets, each presiding over a kind of republican or parliamentary little territory, generally striving each to be on some terms of human neighbourhood with those about him. But in spite of fylketings, folk-things, little parish parliaments, and small combinations of these, which had gradually formed themselves, often reduced to the unhappy state of quarrel with them, Harald Fairhair was the first to put an end to this state of things, and became memorable and profitable to his country by uniting it under one head and making a kingdom of it, which it has continued to be ever since. His father, Halfdan the Black, had already begun this rough but salutary process, inspired by the cupidities and instincts, by the faculties and opportunities, which the good genius of this world, beneficent often enough under savage forms, and diligent at all times to diminish anarchy as the world's worst savagery, usually appoints in such cases. Conquest, hard fighting, followed by wise guidance of the conquered, but it was Harald the Fairhaired, his son, who conspicuously carried it on and completed it. Harald's birth year, death year, and chronology in general are known only by inference and computation, but, by the latest reckoning, he died about the year 933 of our era, a man of 83. The business of conquest lasted Harald about 12 years, A.D. 860 to 872, in which he subdued also the Vikings of the Out Islands, Orkneys, Shetlands, Hebrides, and Man. 60 more years were given him to consolidate and regulate what he had conquered, which he did with great judgment, industry, and success. His reign altogether is counted to have been of over 70 years. The beginning of his great adventure was of a romantic character. Youthful love for the beautiful Gyda, a then glorious and famous young lady of those regions, whom the young Harald aspired to marry. Gyda answered his embassy and prayer in a distant, lofty manner. Her it would not beseem to wed any jarl or poor creature of that kind. Let him do as Gorm of Denmark, Eric of Sweden, Egbert of England, and others had done. subdue into peace and regulation the confused, contentious bits of jarls round him, and become a king. Then, perhaps, she might think of his proposal. Till then, not. Harald was struck with this proud answer, which rendered Gyda tenfold more desirable to him. He vowed to let his hair grow, never to cut or even to comb it till this feat were done, and the peerless Gyda his own. He proceeded accordingly to conquer, in fierce battle, a jarl or two every year, and at the end of 12 years had his unkempt and almost unimaginable head of hair clipped off. Jarl Rognvald, Reginald, of More, the most valued and valuable of all his subject jarls, being promoted to this sublime barber function. After which King Harald, with head thoroughly cleaned, and hair grown or growing again to the luxuriant beauty that had no equal in his day, brought home his Gyda, and made her the brightest queen in all the north. He had after her, in succession, or perhaps even simultaneously in some cases, at least 6 other wives, and by Gyda herself 1 daughter and 4 sons. Harald was not to be considered a strict living man, and he had a great deal of trouble, as we shall see, with the tumultuous ambition of his sons. But he managed his government, aided by Jarl Rognvald and others, in a large, quietly potent, and successful manner, and it lasted in this royal form till his death, after 60 years of it. These were the times of Norse colonization, proud Norsemen flying into other lands, to freer scenes, to Iceland, to the Faroe Islands, which were hitherto quite vacant, tenanted only by some mournful hermit Irish Christian fakir or so; still more copiously to the Orkney and Shetland Isles, the Hebrides, and other countries where Norse squatters and settlers already were. Settlement of Iceland, we say, settlement of the Faroe Islands, and by far the notablest of all, settlement of Normandy by Rolf the Ganger, A.D. 876. Rolf, son of Rognvald, was lord of 3 little islets far north, near the fjord of Folden, called the 3 Vigton Islands. But his chief means of living was that of sea robbery, which, or at least Rolf's conduct in which, Harald did not approve of. In the court of Harald, sea robbery was strictly forbidden as between Harald's own countries, but as against foreign countries it continued to be the one profession for a gentleman. Thus I read, Harald's own chief son, King Eric that afterwards was, had been at sea in such employments ever since his 12th year. Rolf's crime, however, was that in coming home from one of these expeditions, his crew having fallen short of victual, Rolf landed with them on the shore of Norway, and in his strait drove in some cattle there, a crime by law, and proceeded to kill and eat, which, in a little while, he heard that King Harald was on foot to inquire into and punish. Whereupon Rolf the Ganger speedily got into his ships again, got to the coast of France with his sea robbers, got investment by the poor King of France in the fruitful shaggy desert which is since called Normandy, land of the Northmen, and there, gradually felling the forests, banking the rivers, tilling the fields, became, during the next 2 centuries, Wilhelmus Conquestor, the man famous to England and momentous at this day, not to England alone, but to all speakers of the English tongue, now spread from side to side of the world in a wonderful degree. Tancred of Hauteville and his Italian Normans, though important too in Italy, are not worth naming in comparison. This is a ferocious earth, and the grain of mustard seed will grow to miraculous extent in some cases. Harald's chief helper, counsellor, and lieutenant was the above-mentioned Jarl Rognvald of More, who had the honour to cut Harald's dreadful head of hair. This Rognvald was father of Turf Einar, who first invented peat in the Orkneys, finding the wood all gone there, and is remembered to this day. Einar, being come to these islands by King Harald's permission, to see what he could do in them, islands inhabited by what miscellany of Picts, Scots, Norse squatters we do not know, found the indispensable fuel all wasted. Turf Einar, too, may be regarded as a benefactor to his kind. He was, it appears, a bastard, and got no coddling from his father, who disliked him, partly perhaps because he was ugly and blind of an eye, got no flattering even on his conquest of the Orkneys and invention of peat. Here is the parting speech his father made to him, on fitting him out with a long ship, ship of war, dragon ship, ancient 74, and sending him forth to make a living for himself in the world. It were best if thou never camest back, for I have small hope that thy people will have honour by thee. Thy mother's kin throughout is slavish. Harald Haarfagre had a good many sons and daughters. The daughters he married mostly to jarls of due merit who were loyal to him. With the sons, as remarked above, he had a great deal of trouble. They were ambitious, stirring fellows, and grudged at their finding so little promotion from a father so kind to his jarls. Sea robbery by no means an adequate career for the sons of a great king, two of them, Halfdan Halleck, Longleg, and Gudrod Leome, Gleam, jealous of the favours won by the great Jarl Rognvald, surrounded him in his house one night, and burnt him and 60 men to death there. That was the end of Rognvald, the invaluable Jarl, always true to Haarfagre, and distinguished in world history by producing Rolf the Ganger, author of the Norman Conquest of England, and Turf Einar, who invented peat in the Orkneys. Whether Rolf had left Norway at this time there is no chronology to tell me. As to Rolf's surname, Ganger, there are various hypotheses. The likeliest, perhaps, that Rolf was so weighty a man, no horse, small Norwegian horses, big ponies rather, would carry him, and that he usually walked, having a mighty stride withal, and great velocity on foot. One of these murderers of Jarl Rognvald quietly set himself in Rognvald's place, the other making for Orkney to serve Turf Einar in like fashion. Turf Einar, taken by surprise, fled to the mainland, but returned days or perhaps weeks after, ready for battle, fought with Halfdan, put his party to flight, and at next morning's light searched the island and slew all the men he found. As to Halfdan Longleg himself, in fierce memory of his own murdered father, Turf Einar cut an eagle on his back, that is to say, hewed the ribs from each side of the spine, and turned them out like the wings of a spread eagle, a mode of Norse vengeance fashionable at that time in extremely aggravated cases. Harald Haarfagre, in the meantime, had descended upon the Rognvald scene, not in mild mood towards the new Jarl there, indignantly dismissed said Jarl, and appointed a brother of Rognvald, brother notes Dalman, though Rognvald had left other sons. Which done, Haarfagre sailed with all speed to the Orkneys, there to avenge that cutting of an eagle on the human back on Turf Einar's part. Turf Einar did not resist, submissively met the angry Haarfagre, said he left it all, what had been done, what provocation there had been, to Haarfagre's own equity and greatness of mind. Magnanimous Haarfagre inflicted a fine of 60 marks in gold, which was paid in ready money by Turf Einar, and so the matter ended. Chapter 2. Eric Bloodaxe and Brothers. In such violent courses Haarfagre's sons, I know not how many of them, had come to an untimely end. Only Eric, the accomplished sea rover, and 3 others remained to him. Among these 4 sons, rather impatient for property and authority of their own, King Harald, in his old days, tried to part his kingdom in some eligible and equitable way, and retire from the constant press of business, now becoming burdensome to him. To each of them he gave a kind of kingdom. Eric, his eldest, to be head king, and the others to be feudatory under him, and pay a certain yearly contribution, an arrangement which did not answer well at all. Head King Eric insisted on his tribute. Quarrels arose as to the payment, considerable fighting and disturbance, bringing fierce destruction from King Eric upon many valiant but too stubborn Norse spirits, and among the rest upon all his 3 brothers, which got him, from the Norse populations, the surname of Bloodaxe, Eric Bloodaxe, his title in history. One of his brothers he had killed in battle before his old father's life ended. This brother was Bjorn, a peaceable, improving, trading economic under-king, whom the others mockingly called Bjorn the Chapman. The great-grandson of this Bjorn became extremely distinguished by and by as Saint Olaf. Head King Eric seems to have had a violent wife too. She was thought to have poisoned one of her other brothers-in-law. Eric Bloodaxe had by no means a gentle life of it in this world, trained to sea robbery on the coasts of England, Scotland, Ireland, and France, since his 12th year. Old King Fairhair, at the age of 70, had another son, to whom was given the name of Haakon. His mother was a slave in Fairhair's house. Slave by ill luck of war, though nobly enough born. A strange adventure connects this Haakon with England and King Ethelstan, who was then entering upon his great career there. Short while after this Haakon came into the world, there entered Fairhair's palace, one evening as Fairhair sat feasting, an English ambassador or messenger, bearing in his hand, as gift from King Ethelstan, a magnificent sword, with gold hilt and other fine trimmings, to the great Harald, King of Norway. Harald took the sword, drew it, or was half drawing it, admiringly from the scabbard, when the English excellency broke into a scornful laugh. "Ha ha! Thou art now the feudatory of my English king. Thou hast accepted the sword from him, and art now his man." Acceptance of a sword in that manner being the symbol of investiture in those days. Harald looked a trifle flurried, it is probable, but held in his wrath, and did no damage to the tricksy Englishman. He kept the matter in his mind, however, and next summer little Haakon, having got his weaning done, one of the prettiest, healthiest little creatures, Harald sent him off, under the charge of Hawk, so called, one of his principal warriors, with order, take him to England, and instructions what to do with him there. And accordingly, one evening Hawk, with 30 men escorting, strode into Ethelstan's high dwelling, where situated, how built, whether with logs like Harald's, I cannot specifically say, into Ethelstan's high presence, and silently set the wild little cherub upon Ethelstan's knee. "What is this?" asked Ethelstan, looking at the little cherub. "This is King Harald's son, whom a serving maid bore to him, and whom he now gives thee as foster child." Indignant, Ethelstan drew his sword, as if to do the gift a mischief, but Hauk said, "Thou hast taken him on thy knee," common symbol of adoption. "Thou canst kill him if thou wilt, but thou dost not thereby kill all the sons of Harald." Ethelstan straightway took milder thoughts, brought up and carefully educated Haakon, from whom and this singular adventure came before very long the first tidings of Christianity into Norway. Harald Fairhair, latterly withdrawn from all kinds of business, died at the age of 83, about A.D. 933, as is computed. Nearly contemporary in death with the first Danish king, Gorm the Old, who had done a corresponding feat in reducing Denmark under one head. Remarkable old men, these two first kings, and possessed of gifts for bringing chaos a little nearer to the form of Cosmos, possessed, in fact, of loyalties to Cosmos, that is to say, of authentic virtues in the savage state, such as have been needed in all societies at their incipience in this world. A kind of virtues, hugely in discredit at present, but not unlikely to be needed again, to the astonishment of careless persons, before all is done. End of Section 1. Early Kings of Norway. Preface and Chapters 1 and 2. Recording by Laura Koskinen.
Early Kings of Norway. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Early Kings of Norway by Thomas Carlyle. Section 2, Chapters 3 and 4. Chapter 3. Haakon the Good. Eric Bloodaxe, whose practical reign is counted to have begun about A.D. 930, had by this time, or within a year or so of this time, pretty much extinguished all his brother kings, and crushed down recalcitrant spirits, in his violent way, but had naturally become entirely unpopular in Norway, and filled it with silent discontent and even rage against him. Haakon Fairhair's last son, the little foster child of Athelstan in England, who had been baptized and carefully educated, was come to his 14th or 15th year at his father's death, a very shining youth, as Athelstan saw with just pleasure. So soon as the few preliminary preparations had been settled, Haakon, furnished with a ship or two by Athelstan, suddenly appeared in Norway, got acknowledged by the peasant thing in Trondheim, the news of which flew over Norway like a fire through dried grass, says an old chronicler. So that Eric, with his queen Gunhild, and 7 small children, had to run. No other shift for Eric. They went to the Orkneys first of all, then to England, and he got Northumberland as earldom, I vaguely hear from Athelstan. But Eric soon died, and his queen with her children went back to the Orkneys in search of refuge or help, to little purpose there or elsewhere. From Orkney she went to Denmark, where Harald Bluetooth took her poor eldest boy as foster child, but I fear did not very faithfully keep that promise. The Danes had been robbing extensively during the late tumults in Norway. This the Christian Haakon, now established there, paid in kind, and the two countries were at war, so that Gunhild's little boy was a welcome card in the hand of Bluetooth. Haakon proved a brilliant and successful king, regulated many things, public law among others, Gulthing law, Frosthing law. These are little codes of his accepted by their respective things, and had a salutary effect in their time. With prompt dexterity he drove back the Bluetooth foster son invasions every time they came, and on the whole gained for himself the name of Haakon the Good. These Danish invasions were a frequent source of trouble to him, but his greatest and continual trouble was that of extirpating heathen idolatry from Norway, and introducing the Christian Evangel in his stead. His transcendent anxiety to achieve this salutary enterprise was all along his grand difficulty and stumbling block, the heathen opposition to it being also rooted and great. Bishops and priests from England Haakon had, preaching and baptizing what they could, but making only slow progress, much too slow for Haakon's zeal. On the other hand, every Yuletide, when the chief heathen were assembled in his own palace on their grand sacrificial festival, there was great pressure put upon Haakon, as to sprinkling with horseblood, drinking Yule beer, eating horseflesh, and the other distressing rites, the whole of which Haakon abhorred, and with all his steadfastness strove to reject utterly. Sigurd, Jarl of Lade, Trondheim, a liberal heathen, not openly a Christian, was ever a wise counsellor and conciliator in such affairs, and proved a great help to Haakon. Once, for example, there having risen at a Yule feast loud, almost stormful demand that Haakon, like a true man and brother, should drink Yule beer with them in their sacred high tide, Sigurd persuaded him to comply, for peace's sake at least in form. Haakon took the cup in his left hand, excellent hot beer, and with his right cut the sign of the cross above it, then drank a draught. "Yes, but what is this with the king's right hand?" cried the company. "Don't you see?" answered shifty Sigurd. "He makes the sign of Thor's hammer before drinking," which quenched the matter for the time. Horseflesh, horse broth, and the horse ingredient generally, Haakon all but inexorably declined. By Sigurd's pressing exhortation and entreaty, he did once take a kettle of horse broth by the handle, with a good deal of linen quilt or towel interposed, and did open his lips for what of steam could insinuate itself. At another time he consented to a particle of horse liver, intending, privately I guess, to keep it outside the gullet, and smuggle it away without swallowing, but farther than this not even Sigurd could persuade him to go. At the things held in regard to this matter Haakon's success was always incomplete. Now and then it was a plain failure, and Haakon had to draw back till a better time. Here is one specimen of the response he got on such an occasion, curious specimen withal of antique parliamentary eloquence from an anti-Christian thing. At a thing of all the fylks of Trondheim, thing held at Frost in that region, King Haakon, with all the eloquence he had, signified that it was imperatively necessary that all Bonders and sub-Bonders should become Christians, and believe in one God, Christ the Son of Mary, renouncing entirely blood sacrifices and heathen idols, should keep every seventh day holy, abstain from labor that day, and even from food, devoting the day to fasting and sacred meditation. Whereupon, by way of universal answer, arose a confused universal murmur of entire dissent. "Take away from us our old belief, and also our time for labor," murmured they in angry astonishment. "How can even the land be got tilled in that way?" "We cannot work if we don't get food," said the hand laborers and slaves. "It lies in King Haakon's blood," remarked others. "His father and all his kindred were apt to be stingy about food, though liberal enough with money." At length one Osbjorn, or bear of the Ossen or gods, what we now call Osborne, one Osbjorn of Medelhusen Gullethal, stepped forward, and said in a distinct manner, "We Bonders, peasant proprietors, thought, King Haakon, when thou heldest thy first Thing day here in Trondheim, and we took thee for our king, and received our hereditary lands from thee again, that we had got heaven itself. But now we know not how it is, whether we have won freedom, or whether thou intendest anew to make us slaves, with this wonderful proposal that we should renounce our faith, which our fathers before us have held, and all our ancestors as well, first in the age of burial by burning, and now in that of earth burial, and yet these departed ones were much our superiors, and their faith too has brought prosperity to us. Thee at the same time we have loved so much that we raised thee to manage all the laws of the land, and speak as their voice to us all. And even now it is our will and the vote of all Bonders to keep that paction which thou gavest here on the Thing at Frost, and to maintain thee as king, so long as any of us Bonders who are here upon the Thing has life left, provided thou, king, wilt go fairly to work, and demand of us only such things as are not impossible. But if thou wilt fix upon this thing with so great obstinacy, and employ force and power, in that case we Bonders have taken the resolution, all of us, to fall away from thee, and to take for ourselves another head, who will so behave that we may enjoy in freedom the belief which is agreeable to us. Now shalt thou, king, choose one of these two courses before the Thing disperse." Whereupon, adds the chronicle, all the Bonders raised a mighty shout, "Yes, we will have it so, as has been said," so that Jarl Sigurd had to intervene, and King Haakon to choose for the moment the milder branch of the alternative. At other things Haakon was more or less successful. All his days, by such methods as there were, he kept pressing forward with this great enterprise, and on the whole did thoroughly shake asunder the old edifice of heathendom, and fairly introduce some foundation for the new and better rule of law, and life among his people. Sigurd, Jarl of Lade, his wise counsellor in all these matters, is also a man worthy of notice. Haakon's arrangements against the continual invasions of Eric's sons, with Danish Bluetooth backing them, were manifold, and for a long time successful. He appointed, after consultation and consent in the various things, so many warships, fully manned and ready, to be furnished instantly on the king's demand by each province or fjord; watchfires, on fit places, from hill to hill all along the coast, were to be carefully set up, carefully maintained in readiness, and kindled on any alarm of war. By such methods Bluetooth and Company's invasions were for a long while triumphantly, and even rapidly, one and all of them beaten back, till at length they seemed as if intending to cease altogether, and leave Haakon alone of them. But such was not their issue after all. The sons of Eric had only abated under constant discouragement, had not finally left off from what seemed their one great feasibility in life. Gunhild, their mother, was still with them, a most contriving, fierce-minded, irreconcilable woman, diligent and urgent on them, in season and out of season; and as for King Bluetooth, he was at all times ready to help, with his good will at least. That of the alarm fires on Haakon's part was found troublesome by his people. Sometimes it was even hurtful and provoking, lighting your alarm fires and rousing the whole coast and population, when it was nothing but some paltry Viking with a couple of ships. In short, the alarm signal system fell into disuse, and good King Haakon himself, in the first place, paid the penalty. It is counted, by the latest commentators, to have been about A.D. 961, 16th or 17th year of Haakon's pious, valiant, and worthy reign. Being at a feast one day, with many guests, on the island of Stord, sudden announcement came to him that ships from the south were approaching in quantity, and evidently ships of war. This was the biggest of all the Bluetooth foster-son invasions, and it was fatal to Haakon the Good that night. Eyvind, the Skaldaspillir, annihilator of all other Skalds, in his famed Haakon's Song, gives account, and still more pertinently, the always practical Snorro. Danes in great multitude, 6-1, as people afterwards computed, springing swiftly to land, and ranking themselves; Haakon nevertheless at once deciding not to take his ships and run, but to fight there, 1-6, fighting accordingly in his most splendid manner, and at last gloriously prevailing, routing and scattering back to their ships and flight homeward those 6-1 Danes. During the struggle of the fight, says Snorro, he was very conspicuous among other men, and while the sun shone, his bright gilded helmet glanced, and thereby many weapons were directed at him. One of his henchmen, Eyvind Finnson, i.e. Skaldaspillir the poet, took a hat and put it over the king's helmet. Now, among the hostile first leaders were two uncles of the Ericsons, brothers of Gunhild, great champions both. Skreya, the elder of them, on the disappearance of the glittering helmet, shouted boastfully, "Does the king of the Norsemen hide himself, then, or has he fled? Where now is the golden helmet?" And so saying, Skreya, and his brother Alf with him, pushed on like fools or madmen. The king said, "Come on in that way, and ye shall find the king of the Norsemen." And in a short space of time braggart Skreya did come up, swinging his sword, and made a cut at the king; but Thorolf the Strong, an Icelander, who fought at the king's side, dashed his shield so hard against Skreya that he tottered with the shock. On the same instant the king takes his sword Quernbiter, able to cut querns or millstones with both hands, and hews Skreya through helm and head, cleaving him down to the shoulders. Thorolf also slew Alf. That was what they got by such over-hasty search for the king of the Norsemen. Snorro considers the fall of these two champion uncles as the crisis of the fight, the Danish force being much disheartened by such a sight, and King Haakon now pressing on so hard that men gave way before him. The battle on the Ericson part became a whirl of recoil, and in a few minutes more a torrent of mere flight and haste to get on board their ships, and put to sea again, in which operation many of them were drowned, says Snorro, survivors making instant sail for Denmark in that sad condition. This seems to have been King Haakon's finest battle, and the most conspicuous of his victories, due not a little to his own grand qualities shown on the occasion. But alas, it was his last also. He was still zealously directing the chase of that mad Danish flight, or whirl of recoil toward their ships, when an arrow, shot most likely at a venture, hit him under the left armpit, and this proved his death. He was helped into his ship, and made sail for Ericstad, where his chief residence in those parts was, but had to stop at a smaller place of his, which had been his mother's, and where he himself was born, a place called Hela, the flat rock, still known as Haakon's Hela, faint from loss of blood, and crushed down as he had never before felt. Having no son and only one daughter, he appointed these invasions of Eric to be sent for, and if he died to become king, but to spare his friends and kindred. If a longer life be granted me, he said, I will go out of this land to Christian men, and do penance for what I have committed against God. But if I die in the country of the heathen, let me have such burial as you yourselves think fittest. These are his last recorded words. And in heathen fashion he was buried, and besung by Eyvind and the Skalds, though himself a zealously Christian king. Haakon the Good, so one still finds him worthy of being called. The sorrow on Haakon's death, Snorro tells us, was so great and universal, that he was lamented both by friends and enemies, and they said that never again would Norway see such a king. Chapter 4. Harald Greyfell and Brothers. Eric's sons, 4 or 5 of them, with a Harald at the top, now once got Norway in hand, all of it but Trondheim, as king and under kings, and made a severe time of it for those who had been or seemed to be their enemies. Excellent Jarl Sigurd, always so useful to Haakon and his country, was killed by them, and they came to repent that before very long. The slain Sigurd left a son, Haakon, as Jarl, who became famous in the northern world by and by. This Haakon, and him only, would the Trondheimers accept as sovereign. Death to him, then, said the sons of Eric, but only in secret, till they had got their hands free and were ready, which was not yet for some years. Nay, Haakon, when actually attacked, made good resistance, and threatened to cause trouble. Nor did he by any means get his death from these sons of Eric at this time, or till long afterwards at all, from one of their kin, as it chanced. On the contrary, he fled to Denmark now, and by managed to come back to their cost. Among their other chief victims were 2 cousins of their own, Tryggva and Gudrod, who had been honest underkings to the late head king, Haakon the Good, but were now become suspect, and had to fight for their lives, and lose them in tragic manner. Tryggva had a son, whom we shall hear of. Gudrod, son of worthy Bjorn the chapman, was grandfather of Saint Olaf, whom all men have heard of, who has a church in Southwark even, and another in Old Jewry to this hour. In all these violences, Gunhild, widow of the late King Eric, was understood to have a principal hand. She had come back to Norway with her sons, and naturally passed for the secret adviser and maternal president in whatever of violence went on, always reckoned a fell, vehement, relentless personage where her own interests were concerned. Probably, as things settled, her influence on affairs grew less. At least, one hopes so, and in the Sagas hears less and less of her, and before long, nothing. Harald, the head king in this Eric fraternity, does not seem to have been a bad man, the contrary indeed, but his position was untowardly, full of difficulty and contradictions. Whatever Harald could accomplish for behoof of Christianity, or real benefit to Norway, in these cross circumstances, he seems to have done in a modest and honest manner. He got the name of Greyfell from his people on a very trivial account, but seemingly with perfect good humour on their part. Some Iceland trader had brought a cargo of furs to Trondheim, Lad, for sale. Sale being slacker than the Icelander wished, he presented a chosen specimen, cloak, doublet, or whatever it was, to Harald, who wore it with acceptance in public, and rapidly brought disposal of the Icelander's stock, and the surname of Greyfell to himself. His under-kings and he were certainly not popular, though I almost think Greyfell himself, in absence of his mother and the under-kings, might have been so. But here they all were, and had wrought great trouble in Norway. Too many of them, said everybody, too many of these courts and court people, eating up any substance that there is. For the seasons withal, 2 or 3 of them in succession, were bad for grass, much more for grain, no herring came either, very cleanness of teeth was likely to come in Eyvind Skaldaspiller's opinion. This scarcity became at last their share of the great famine of A.D. 975, which desolated Western Europe. See the poem in the Saxon Chronicle. And all this by Eyvind Skaldaspiller, and the heathen Norse in general, was ascribed to anger of the heathen gods. Discontent in Norway, and especially in Eyvind's Skaldaspillir, seems to have been very great. Whereupon exile Haakon, Jarl Sigurd's son, bestirs himself in Denmark, backed by old King Bluetooth, and begins invading and encroaching in a miscellaneous way, especially intriguing and contriving plots all round him. An unfathomably cunning kind of fellow, as well as an audacious and strong-handed. Intriguing in Trondheim, where he gets the Under-King, Greyfell's brother, fallen upon and murdered; intriguing with Gold Harald, a distinguished cousin or nephew of King Bluetooth's, who had done fine Viking work, and gained such wealth that he got the epithet of Gold, and who now was infinitely desirous of a share in Bluetooth's kingdom as the proper finish to these sea rovings. He even ventured one day to make publicly a distinct proposal, that way to King Harald Bluetooth himself, who flew into thunder and lightning at the mere mention of it, so that none durst speak to him for several days afterwards. Of both these Haralds Haakon was confidential friend, and needed all his skill to walk without immediate annihilation between such a pair of dragons, and work out Norway for himself withal. In the end he found he must take solidly to Bluetooth's side of the question, and that they two must provide a recipe for Gold Harald and Norway both at once. "It is as much as your life is worth to speak again of sharing this Danish kingdom," said Haakon very privately to Gold Harald; "but could not you, my golden friend, be content with Norway for a kingdom, if one helped you to it?" "That could I well," answered Harald. "Then keep me these 9 warships you have just been rigging for a new Viking cruise; have these in readiness when I lift my finger." That was the recipe contrived for Gold Harald. Recipe for King Greyfell goes into the same vial, and is also ready. Hitherto the Haakon Bluetooth disturbances in Norway had amounted to but little. King Greyfell, a very active and valiant man, has constantly, without much difficulty, repelled these sporadic bits of troubles. But Greyfell, all the same, would willingly have peace with dangerous old Bluetooth, ever anxious to get his clutches over Norway on any terms, if peace with him could be had. Bluetooth, too, professes every willingness, inveigles Greyfell, he and Haakon do, to have a friendly meeting on the Danish borders, and not only settle all these quarrels, but generously settle Greyfell in certain fiefs which he claimed in Denmark itself, and so swear everlasting friendship. Greyfell joyfully complies, punctually appears at the appointed day in Limford Sound, the appointed place. Whereupon Haakon gives signal to Gold Harald, "To Limfjord with these 9 ships of yours, swift!" Gold Harald flies to Limfjord with his ships, challenges King Harald Greyfell to land and fight, which the undaunted Greyfell, though so far outnumbered, does, and fighting his very best, perishes there, he and almost all his people. Which done, Jarl Haakon, who is in readiness, attacks Gold Harald, the victorious but the wearied, easily beats Gold Harald, takes him prisoner, and instantly hangs and ends him, to the huge joy of King Bluetooth and Haakon, who now make instant voyage to Norway, drive all the brother Under-Kings into rapid flight to the Orkneys, to any readiest shelter, and so, under the patronage of Bluetooth, Haakon, with the title of Jarl, becomes ruler of Norway. This foul treachery done on the brave and honest Harald Greyfell is by some dated about A.D. 969, by Munch 965, by others, computing out of Snorro only, 975. For there is always an uncertainty in these Icelandic dates, say rather, rare and rude attempts at dating, without even an A.D. or other fixed year 1 to go upon in Iceland, though seldom, I think, so large a discrepancy as here. End of Section 2. Early Kings of Norway, Chapters 3 and 4.
Section 3 of Early Kings of Norway. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Christine. Early Kings of Norway by Thomas Carlyle. Section 3. Early Kings of Norway, Chapter 5 and 6. Chapter 5. Haakon Jarl. Haakon Jarl, such the style he took, had engaged to pay some kind of tribute to King Bluetooth, if he could, but he never did pay any, pleading always the necessity of his own affairs, with which excuse, joined to Haakon's readiness in things less important, King Bluetooth managed to content himself, Haakon being always his good neighbor, at least, and the two mutually dependent. In Norway, Haakon, without the title of king, did in a strong-handed, steadfast, and at length successful way the office of one, governed Norway, some count, for about 20 years, and, both at home and abroad, had much consideration through most of that time, specially amongst the heathen Orthodox, for Haakon Jarl himself was a zealous heathen, fixed in his mind against these chimerical Christian innovations and unsalutary changes of creed, and would have gladly trampled out all traces of what the last two kings, for Greyfell also was an English Christian after his sort, had done in this respect. But he wisely discerned that it was not possible, and that, for peace's sake, he must not even attempt it, but must strike preferably into perfect toleration, and that of every one getting to heaven or even to the other goal in his own way. He himself, it is well known, repaired many heathen temples, a great church builder in his way, manufactured many splendid idols, with much gilding and such artistic ornament as there was; in particular, one huge image of Thor, not forgetting the hammer and appendages, and such a collar, supposed of solid gold, which it was not quite, as we shall hear in time, round the neck of him as was never seen in all the North. How did his own Jule festivals, with what magnificent solemnity, the horse eatings, blood sprinklings, and other sacred rites need not be told. Something of a ritualist, one may perceive, perhaps had Scandinavian Puseyisms in him, and other desperate heathen notions. He was universally believed to have gone into magic, for one thing, and to have dangerous potencies derived from the devil himself; the dark heathen mind of him struggling vehemently in that strange element, not altogether so unlike our own in some points. For the rest, he was evidently, in practical matters, a man of sharp, clear insight, of steadfast resolution, diligence, promptitude, and managed his secular matters uncommonly well; had 16 Jarls under him, though himself only Haakon Jarl by title, and got obedience from them stricter than any king since Haarfagr had done. Add to which that the country had years excellent for grass and crop, and that the herrings came in exuberance, tokens, to the thinking mind, that Haakon Jarl was a favorite of heaven. His fight with the far famed Jomsvikings was his grandest exploit in public rumor. Jomsburg, a locality not known now, except that it was near the mouth of the river Oder, denoted in those ages the impregnable castle of a certain hotly corporate, or sea robbery association limited, which for some generations held the Baltic in terror and plundered far beyond the belt, in the ocean itself, in Flanders, and the opulent trading havens there; above all, in opulent anarchic England, which, for 40 years from about this time, was the Pirates' Gotham, and yielded regularly every summer slaves, Danegeld, and miscellaneous plunder like no other country Jomsburg or the Viking world had ever known. Palnatoke, Bue, and the other quasi heroic heads of this establishment are still remembered in the northern parts. Palnatoke is the title of a tragedy by Oehlenschläger, which had its run of immortality in Copenhagen some 60 or 70 years ago. I judge the institution to have been in its flowery state, probably, now in Haakon Jarl's time. Haakon Jarl and these pirates robbing Haakon's subjects and merchants that frequented him, were naturally in quarrel, and frequent fightings had fallen out, not generally to the profit of the Jomsburgers, who at least determined on revenge, and the rooting out of this obstructive Haakon Jarl. They assembled in force at the Cape of Stad, in the Furdafylke, and the fight was dreadful in the extreme, noise of it filling all the north for long afterwards. Haakon, fighting like a lion, could scarcely hold his own. Death or victory, the word on both sides, when suddenly the heavens grew black, and there broke out a terrific storm of thunder and hail, appalling to the human mind. Universe swallowed wholly in black night. Only the momentary forked blazes, the thunder pealing as of Ragnarok, and the battering hail torrents, hailstones about the size of an egg. Thor with his hammer evidently acting, but in behalf of whom? The Jomsburgers in the hideous darkness, broken only by flashing thunderbolts, had a dismal apprehension that it was probably not on their behalf. Thor having a sense of justice in him, and before the storm ended 35 of their 70 ships sheered away, leaving gallant Bue with the other 35 to follow as they liked, who reproachfully hailed these fugitives, and continued the now hopeless battle. Bue's nose and lips were smashed or cut away. Bue managed half articulately to exclaim, "Ha! the maids of Funen will never kiss me more. Overboard, all ye boys men!" And taking his 2 sea chests, with all the gold he had gained in such life struggle from of old, sprang overboard accordingly, and finished the affair. Haakon Jarl's renown rose naturally to the transcendent pitch after this exploit. His people, I suppose chiefly the Christian part of them, whispered one to another, with a shudder, that in the blackest of the thunderstorm he had taken his youngest little boy, and made away with him, sacrificed him to Thor or some devil, and gained his victory by art magic, or something worse. Jarl Eric, Haakon's eldest son, without suspicion of art magic, but already a distinguished Viking, became thrice distinguished by his style of sea fighting in this battle, and awakened great expectations in the Viking public. Of him we shall hear again. The Jomsburgers, one might fancy, after this sad clap went visibly down in the world, but the fact is not altogether so. Old King Bluetooth was now dead, died of a wound got in battle with his unnatural, so-called natural son and successor, Otto Svein of the Forked Beard, afterwards King and Conqueror of England for a little while, and seldom, perhaps never, had Vikingism been in such flower as now. This man's name is Sven in Swedish, Svend in German, and means boy or lad, the English Swain. It was at old Father Bluetooth's funeral ale, drunken burial feast, that Sweyn, carousing with his Jomsburg chiefs and other choice spirits, generally of the robber class, all risen into height of highest robber enthusiasm, pledged a vow to one another, Sweyn that he would conquer England, which in a sense he after long struggling did, and the Jomsburgers that they would ruin and root out Haakon Jarl, which, as we have just seen, they could by no means do, and other guests other foolish things which proved equally unfeasible. Sea robber volunteers so especially abounding in that time, one perceives how easily the Jomsburgers could recruit themselves, build or refit new robber fleets, man them with the pick of crews, and steer for opulent, fruitful England, where, under Ethelbert the Unready, was such a field for profitable enterprise as the Viking public never had before or since. An idle question sometimes rises on me, idle enough, for it never can be answered in the affirmative or the negative, whether it was not these same refitted Jomsburgers who appeared some while after this at Redhead Point, on the shore of Angus, and sustained a new severe beating, in what the Scotch still faintly remember as their Battle of Loncarty. Beyond doubt a powerful Norse pirate armament dropped anchor at the Red Head, to the alarm of peaceable mortals, about that time. It was thought and hoped to be on its way for England, but it visibly hung on for several days, deliberating, as was thought, whether they would do this poorer coast the honor to land on it before going farther. Did land, and vigorously plunder and burn southwestward as far as Perth, laid siege to Perth, but brought out King Kenneth on them, and produced that Battle of Loncarty, which still dwells in vague memory among the Scots. Perhaps it might be the Jomsburgers, perhaps also not, for there were many pirate associations, lasting not from century to century like the Jomsburgers, but only for very limited periods, or from year to year; indeed, it was mainly by such that the splendid thief harvest of England was reaped in this disastrous time. No Scottish chronicle gives the least of exact date to their famed victory of Longcarty, only that it was achieved by Kenneth III, which will mean some time between A.D. 975 and 994, and, by the order they put it in, probably soon after 975, or the beginning of this Kenneth's reign. Buchanan's narrative, carefully distilled from all the ancient Scottish sources, is of admirable quality for style, and otherwise quite brief, with perfect clearness, perfect credibility even, except that semi-miraculous appendage of the ploughman, Hay and Sons, always hanging to the tail of it, the grain of possible truth in which can now never be extracted by man's art. In brief, what we know is, fragments of ancient human bones and armor have occasionally been ploughed up in this locality, proof positive of ancient fighting here, and the fight fell out not long after Haakon's beating of the Jomsburgers at the Cape of Stad. And in such dim glimmer of wavering twilight, the question whether these of Longcarty were refitted Jomsburgers or not, must be left hanging. Longcarty is now the biggest bleach field in Queen Victoria's dominions; no village or hamlet there, only the huge bleaching house and a beautiful field, some 6 or 7 miles northwest of Perth, bordered by the beautiful Tay River on the one side and by its beautiful tributary Almond on the other. A Longcarty fitted either for bleaching linen, or for a bit of fair duel between nations in those simple times. Whether our refitted Jomsburgers had the least thing to do with it is only matter of fancy, but if it were they who here again got a good beating, fancy would be glad to find herself fact. The old piratical kings of Denmark had been at the founding of Jomsburg, and to Svein of the Forked Beard it was still vitally important, but not so to the great Knut, or any king that followed, all of whom had better business than mere thieving, and it was Magnus the Good of Norway, a man of still higher anti-anarchic qualities, that annihilated it about a century later. Haakon Jarl, his chief labors in the world being over, is said to have become very dissolute in his elder days, especially in the matter of women. The wretched old fool, led away by idleness and fullness of bread, which to all of us are well said to be the parents of mischief. Having absolute power, he got into the habit of openly plundering men's pretty daughters and wives from them, and, after a few weeks, sending them back, greatly to the rage of the fierce Norse heart, had there been any means of resisting or revenging. It did after a little while prove the ruin and destruction of Haakon the Rich, as he was then called. It opened the door, namely, for entry of Olaf Tryggvason upon the scene, a very much grander man, in regard to whom the wiles and traps of Haakon proved to be a recipe, not on Tryggvason, but on the wily Haakon himself, as shall now be seen straightway. CHAPTER VI. Olaf Tryggvason. Haakon in late times had heard of a famous stirring person, victorious in various lands and seas, latterly united in sea robbery with Svein, Prince Royal of Denmark, afterwards King Svein of the Double Beard, or Fork Beard, both of whom had already done transcendent feats in the Viking way during his copartnery. The fame of Svein and this stirring personage, whose name was Ol, and recently their stupendous feats in plunder of England, siege of London, and other wonders and splendors of Viking glory and success, had gone all over the north, awakening the attention of Haakon and everybody there. The name of Ol was enigmatic, mysterious, and even dangerous looking to Haakon Jarl, who at length sent out a confidential spy to investigate this Ol. a feat which the confidential spy did completely accomplish, by no means to Haakon's profit. The mysterious owl proved to be no other than Olaf, son of Tryggve, destined to blow Haakon Jarl suddenly into destruction, and become famous among the heroes of the Norse world. Of Olaf Tryggvason one always hopes there might, one day, some real outline of a biography be written, fished from the abysses where, as usual, it welters deep in foul neighborhood for the present. Farther on we intend a few words more upon the matter, but in this place all that concerns us in it limits itself to the two following facts: first, that Haakon's confidential spy found Ole in Dublin, picked acquaintance with him, got him to confess that he was actually Olaf, son of Tryggve, the Tryggve whom Bloodaxe's fierce widow and her sons had murdered, got him gradually to own that perhaps an expedition into Norway might have its chances, and finally that, under such a wise and loyal guidance as his, the confidential spy's, whose friendship for Tryggvason was so indubitable, he, Tryggvason, would actually try it upon Haakon Jarl, the dissolute old scoundrel. Fact second is, that about the time they two set sail from Dublin on their Norway expedition, Haakon Jarl removed to Trondhjem, then called Lade, intending to pass some months there. Now just about the time when Tryggvason, spy and party had landed in Norway and were advancing upon Lade, with what support from the public could be got, dissolute old Haakon Jarl had heard of one Gudrun, a Bonder's wife, unparalleled in beauty, who was called in those parts Sunbeam of the Grove, so inexpressibly lovely, and sent off a couple of thralls to bring her to him. Never, answered Gudrun, never, her indignant husband, in a tone dangerous and displeasing to these court thralls, who had to leave rapidly, but threatened to return in better strength before long. Whereupon, instantly, the indignant Bonder and his Sunbeam of the Grove sent out their war arrow, rousing all the country into angry promptitude, and more than one perhaps into greedy hope of revenge for their own injuries. The rest of Haakon's history now rushes on with extreme rapidity. Sunbeam of the Grove, when next demanded of her Bonder, has the whole neighborhood assembled in arms round her. Rumor of Tryggvason is fast making it the whole country. Haakon's insolent messengers are cut in pieces. Haakon finds he cannot fly under cover too soon. With a single slave he flies the same night. But whitherward? Can think of no safe place, except some old mistress of his, who lives retired in that neighborhood, and has some pity or regard for the wicked old Haakon. Old mistress does receive him, pities him, will do all she can to protect and hide him. But how, by what uttermost stretch of female artifice, hide him here? Every one will search here first of all. Old mistress, by the slave's help, extemporizes a cellar under the floor of her pig house, sticks Haakon and slave into that, as the one safe seclusion she can contrive. Haakon and slave, begranted by the pigs above them, tortured by the devils within and about them, passed 2 days in circumstances more and more horrible. For they heard, through their light slit and breathing slit, the triumph of Tryggvason proclaiming itself by Tryggvason's own lips, who had mounted a big boulder near by and was victoriously speaking to the people, winding up with a promise of honors and rewards to whoever should bring him wicked old Haakon's head. Wretched Haakon, justly suspecting his slave, tried to at least keep himself awake. Slave did keep himself awake, till Haakon dozed or slept, then swiftly cut off Haakon's head, and plunged out with it to the presence of Tryggvason. Tryggvason, detesting the traitor, useful as the treachery was, cut off the slave's head too, had it hung up along with Haakon's on the pinnacle of the Lade gallows, where the populace pelted both heads with stones and many curses, especially the more important of the two. Haakon the Bad ever henceforth, instead of Haakon the Rich. This was the end of Haakon Jarl, the last support of heathenry in Norway. Among other characteristics he had a strong-handed, hard-headed, very relentless, greedy, and wicked being. He is reckoned to have ruled in Norway, or mainly ruled, either in the struggling or triumphant state, for about 30 years (965 till 995). He and his seem to have formed, by chance rather than design, the chief opposition which the Haarfagr posterity throughout its whole course experienced in Norway. Such the cost to them of killing good Jarl Sigurd in Greyfell's time. For, curses like chickens, do sometimes visibly come home to feed, as they always, either visibly or else invisibly, are punctually sure to do. Haakon Jarl is considerably connected with the Faroer Saga, often mentioned there, and comes out perfectly in character, an altogether worldly wise man of the roughest type, not without a turn for practicality of kindness to those who would really be of use to him. His tendencies to magic also are not forgotten. Haakon left 2 sons, Eric and Svein, often also mentioned in this saga. On their father's death they fled to Sweden, to Denmark, and very busy stirring up troubles in those countries against Olaf Tryggvason, till at length, by a favourable combination, under their auspices chiefly, they got his brief and noble reign put an end to. Nay, furthermore, Jarl Eric left sons, especially an elder son, named also Eric, who proved a sore affliction and a continual stone of stumbling to a new generation of Haarfagrs, and so continued the curse of Sigurd's murder upon them. Towards the end of this Haakon's reign it was that the discovery of America took place (985). Actual discovery, it appears, by Eric the Red, an Icelander, concerning which there has been abundant investigation and discussion in our time. Ginnungagap, roaring abyss, is thought to be mouth of Behring Strait in Baffin's Bay. Big Helloland, the coast of Cape Walsingham to near Newfoundland. Little Helloland, Newfoundland itself. Markland was Lower Canada, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia. Southward thence to Chesapeake Bay was called Vineland. Wild grapes still grow in Rhode Island, and more luxuriantly farther south. White Man's Land, called also Great Ireland, is supposed to mean the 2 Carolinas, down to the southern cape of Florida. In Dahlmann's opinion, the Irish themselves might even pretend to have probably been the first discoverers of America. They had evidently got to Iceland itself before the Norse exiles found it out. It appears to be certain that, from the end of the 10th century to the early part of the 14th, there was a dim knowledge of those distant shores extant in the Norse mind, and even some straggling series of visits thither by roving Norsemen, though, as only danger, difficulty, and no profit resulted, the visits ceased, and the whole matter sank into oblivion, and, but for the Icelandic talent of writing in the long winter nights, would never have been heard of by posterity at all. End of Section 3 of Early Kings of Norway, Chapters 5 and 6.